Oh, I see. She does say recording in progress. So, welcome everyone. It's so lovely to see you all, and it's a very strange feeling for me to be looking at all online. It reminds me of COVID. Um, I work in a cancer support centre, cancer support and information, and we provide psychological, emotional support for people whose lives are turned upside down by cancer diagnosis. And we also do work following right through to hopefully to cure, to nobody would ever say that now, but to remission, and hopefully to live the rest of their lives. And for some, they get recurrence. And in fact, one of the innovations that we've just started at the cancer charity where I work is that we're actually set up a group for people living with incurable cancer, because people are living longer and longer. 24 years ago when I started, life was very uncertain for people who had secondary cancer. And now the treatments are so good that people are living longer. So it challenges us in a different way. How do we live with uncertainty? So I must admit, when Mark asked me to share some thoughts, I said yes, and then I've probably spent the last 5 weeks regretting it, because if you have a look at my dining room table, I've done so much reading for the last 5 weeks. But also I wanted to stop and think about Lent, why we're doing it in Lent, and I wanted to think about what the readings meant for me. And I'm going to start off. There's a very unusual tradition in the parish of Tinmouth, and it's to do with Christmas. And I make a promise to Mark every year that we watch a Christmas film every month. We're about 36 behind at the moment. But you can probably see, I don't know if you can, I've got a big angel here. There is a big nativity up there. And I'm going to start by singing, I wish it could be Christmas every day. Now, why on earth am I saying that? Partly because I love Christmas, but because Christmas is the day that we celebrate where God became man. But what does that mean? That helpless babe in the manger brought hope into the world. Without Christmas, we wouldn't have Easter. We wouldn't have resurrection. So that was my starting point. And then I took lots of exegesis, lots of books to look at what happened, what was the times, what were the times that Lazarus and Martha and Mary lived? What were they like? How was it for them? And it reminded me, I don't know if many of you remember, John McCarthy was kidnapped in Beirut, I think it was, and he was kept in isolation for quite a period of time. And then him and Terry Waite were kept for a year or two in an underground room. And I always remember, and it struck me very deeply, that how did they survive for 2 years, whatever it was, underground, without light sometimes, not knowing anything of the outside world, not knowing anything about their families. But I always remember, and it struck me profoundly, that I remember him saying, I used to take Terry on one of my favourite walks. So I said, oh, that's interesting, because, sometimes if you're away from home, you think about something that's familiar. But he said, no, I used to take him on the walk. So I didn't just used to tell him about the walk. I took him on the walk. So if a walk lasted for an hour, they walked for an hour together. And as he walked, he described the places that were there. So if I was to walk from Tinmouth and I walked down to the seafront, I would tell you about the waves. I would tell you about the people I see. I would tell you about the seawall. I would tell you about everything that I see. So that actually, when they came out of, when they met after they were released, they would know each other's favourite walks because they've already walked it. So there was something in Ignatian spirituality, the Jesuits, there's a really beautiful way of standing as a bystander, but even more so, actually immersing yourself in the story. So tonight, I want you to immerse yourselves in this story of Martha and Mary. And if you're like me, it's a reading that often I relate to funerals, because there's that beautiful, which we'll look at in a bit, I am the resurrection and the life. What does that mean? it means everything to us because we're all going to die. So it makes sense of our death that there's new life. But also there's a meaning that it has in Lent, that we can be reborn, that we can actually rise from things that we're finding difficult. And they're the sorts of things, if we immerse ourselves in the story, almost become a bystander and to look. I don't know if any of you have heard of Wintershall. It's a passion play in Guildford in Surrey. And when you go there, the actors are part of the crowd. So Jesus sort of appears in the middle of the area where you're sitting. But they also have Roman guards and they have disciples and they have all these people pottering around. And I always remember being immersed in the story again. There was a Roman soldier who came over and he pushed me. And I wanted to punch him because I was so angry that he was punching me. I think it was coming up to the crucifixion. And I was really put out. And then I realized actually that's what it would have been like, that I was being pushed around, get out of here. And I just thought he was being rude at first. And then it's actually realizing that that would have happened. So I want us to immerse ourselves in the story. It's probably going to be a bit scratchy, all of this, but I want to read it. And when I read it, I want you to remember, because I want to do something at the end of the talk as well. I want you to remember a phrase that means something to you. It can be a word or a phrase, and it can be just touching your life tonight as you listen to it. Really listen and think about it. And at the end of the evening, I'm going to read a different version and I want you to remember it. And then I want you to do something with it for our final bit of Lent, which is about preparation. So you'll be amazed at how much I was shocked by how much is in this story and how much I miss, because I usually listen and think, oh, it's the Raising of Lazarus. I know this one. And you switch off and I think about everything else and then I tune in and then I switch out. Let's tune in tonight. Let's try and be a bystander, actually observing what happens and then apply it to ourselves. So a man was ill, Lazarus from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who had anointed the Lord with perfumed oil and dried his feet with her hair. It was her brother Lazarus who was ill. So the sisters sent word to him saying, Master, the one you love is ill. When Jesus heard this, he said, this illness is not to end in death, but it is for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that he was ill, he remained for 2 days in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to the disciples, let's go back to Judea. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just trying to stone you, and you want to go back there? Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours in a day? If one walks during the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of the world. But if one walks at night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him. He said this and then told them, our friend Lazarus is asleep, but I am going to awaken him. So the disciples said to him, Master, if he's asleep, he will be saved. But Jesus was talking about his death, while they thought that he meant ordinary sleep. So then Jesus said to them clearly, Lazarus has died, and I am glad for you that I was not there, that you may believe. Let us go to him. So Thomas, called Didymus, said to the fellow disciples, let us also go to die with him. When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, only about 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him, but Mary sat at home. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise. Martha said to him, I know he will rise in the resurrection on the last day. Jesus told her, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, even if he dies, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? She said to him, Yes, Lord, I have come to believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, the one who is coming into the world. When she had said this, she went and called her sister Mary secretly, saying, The teacher is here, and he is asking for you. As soon as she heard this, she rose quickly and went to him. For Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still where Martha had met him. So when the Jews who were with her in the house comforting her saw Mary get up quickly and go out, they followed her, presuming that she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her weeping, he became perturbed and deeply troubled, and said, Where have you laid him? They said, Master, come and see. And Jesus wept. So the Jews said, See how he loved them. But some of them said, Could not the one who opened the eyes of the blind man have done something so that this man would not have died? So Jesus, perturbed again, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay across it. Jesus said, Take away the stone. Martha, the dead man's sister, said to him, Lord, by now there will be a stench. He's been dead for 4 days. And Jesus said to her, Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. And Jesus raised his eyes and said, Father, I thank you for hearing me. I know that you always hear me, but because of the crowd here, I have said this, that they may believe that you sent me. And when he had said this, he cried out in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, tied hand and foot with burial bands, and his face wrapped in a cloth. So Jesus said to them, Untie him and let him go. Now many of the Jews who had come to Mary and seen what he had done began to believe in him. Wow. It's much longer than I remember, but actually it's so rich in so many things. And what are some of the themes there that we hear? There's a family who are walking alongside their brother who's dying. And I think all of us in our life will know somebody who's been sick. We will probably be touched at some point in our lives by somebody who's died. And we will remember the sadness that we felt walking alongside that person, how we might have been there with them. But not only amongst that, we've got love, an amazing love, and we'll explore that in a minute. But there's a deep friendship in amongst that grief and mourning, that friendship, and others going alongside those who are mourning. And ultimately, we come to a place of hope. And hope is what our Christian faith is all about. But it's a bit messy before that. Before that hope comes, there's real hurt and sadness. So Bethany is about 2 miles from Jerusalem. It said in the reading, doesn't it? It's just in the occupied territories in the West Bank, and we hear a lot about Palestine, which we remember very much in our prayers at this time. And it says that Lazarus lived with his sisters, so Martha and Mary. So it's really unusual. If you look at other places in the Bible where Martha and Mary and Lazarus are mentioned, it's usually Martha who seems to be the head of the household. That's fair enough, we might say. But if we actually go to the time of when this happened, it was a very patriarchal society. So it was the men who did everything. I think thank goodness we've come so far from that patriarchal society now, although sometimes maybe it is still there. So the man should be the head of the house. So why isn't he the head of the house? Question mark, I'm going to come back to in a minute. But Martha was there, and we always see Martha as the busy one. I think she got a bit of the bad press, didn't she, when she came out, was trying to cook, and Jesus said, come and sit at the feet. Mary's taken the better part. So Mary's the contemplative one. She's the quiet one, and Martha's the one who organises everybody. So if we picture that scene, then Martha is doing most of the caring for Lazarus, probably helping Mary, because Mary might not be that helpful at times. Probably she feels things very deeply and is very sensitive. So Martha will be the busy one. If you actually think, when we're going through a tough time, what do we do? What are our two ways of coping? We either withdraw, don't we, and we become a bit sullen, we're a bit thoughtful, or we become really busy. Because if we're really busy, we don't have to think about it. But actually, Mary's almost doing both, isn't she? She's thinking about it. And she's the one who actually says, I want Jesus to come. We need him here. So it shows a sign of friendship. All of us will have friends for different things, won't we? So we have friends that we go for a drink with. We have friends that we just go and be with. I've just been to a memorial service for a lovely man from Teignmouth called John Pyle, and it was really funny. He was a man of few words, and his other friend was a man of few words, and they used to go out fishing together for hours. And he actually said, I chatted to his friend, who's really sad. They've been friends for 40 years. He said sometimes they went out all night fishing and they never said a word to each other. And they responded to the sea. So if there was a big wave coming, they both moved at the same time. They were in tune. There was a friendship. So we have friends for so many things, but we also have friends where it's a bolt hole. Remember, Jesus had nowhere to lay his head. He needed somewhere to lay his head. He needed to get away from the crowds. And Martha, Mary, and Lazarus provided that bolt hole for him. And they're mentioned a few times, aren't they, in the Gospels? So we know that he was a friend to them. But what does Mary say? She says, he whom you love is ill. Right, us British people are fab, aren't we? I love a Mars bar. I love my wife. I love my dog. So that word love is the same for all those things, but obviously in the context, it means different things. And if we actually look at the Greek, which is used, Jesus actually uses, in this context with his friends, philia, which is a brotherly love, a family love, a really close friendship. But he also uses agape when we hear him in a minute. So let's have a look at some of the Greek words. So there's storge. We're all very storge-like because we have family, and hopefully our families are a place of nurturing. So if it's a place of nurturing, we have that unconditional love that we give. So we fall out with our brothers and sisters, when we're growing up, but actually they're always there. We fall out with mum and dad, but actually they're always there. It's that unconditional, firm family love. Then you have the philia love, which is a brotherly, sisterly friendship, go out for a pint, slap on the back, but actually talk to each other. There's a closeness there as well. Then you have pragma, which is an enduring love. And I often see when I go shopping down in Teignmouth, you see elderly people together helping each other with their shopping. A love that's endured, they're helping each other. And then you have that agape, which Jesus uses a lot, and maybe Lent is about us trying to learn what agape is for us. It's unconditional, it's universal, it's going the extra mile, it's reaching out to people, it's entering into people's suffering, it's not thinking of ourselves, but thinking of the other person. And I often think if in marriage or in close friendship we practice agape, it's going to be very difficult to hurt people, isn't it? To hurt the other person because we're thinking of them all the time. But we live in the real world and we know that we get caught up with the busyness of life. But it's interesting how that one word love that we have in the English language has such a rich connection in the Gospels. So when Martha actually says, he who you love is ill, what a message that's saying to Jesus. We need you, There was no expectation. They didn't say, come. He just said, he who you love is ill. So they know that that would have touched Jesus's heart. So the other thing I wanted to say, going back to the patriarchal society and why we think Martha was the head of the household, and I'm going to throw this in because it had a profound effect on me when I thought about it. And the beauty of the scriptures is that we enter into it. Every time we read it, we enter into it and find something new. So as bystanders tonight, we're finding something new in this story, which we've heard hundreds of times, often at funerals. And I want to just throw a bit of a hand grenade in, which it was for me. I have two children, Joseph and Gabriella. Gabriella has special needs. And as a parent, it's been a very hard journey at times. She is the light of my life, and it's hard work. She touches, we say people are ellified because Ella touches their life in a way that I can't touch them. She lives her life in the moment. What if Lazarus was disabled? How does that change the story? Did he have a degenerative illness? Or if he was disabled, that would mean he was even more cast aside in the society. I lived in Kenya, privileged to live in Kenya for 2 years. And one of my most profound moments when I was in Kenya, as well as the poverty and the vibrancy of life, was the way that they held disability. So very politically non-correct. They were still called cripples and things. But I remember visiting one homestead, you know, with the mud huts, and there was a girl who had cerebral palsy. She couldn't walk and she couldn't talk properly. And she was just kept in the hut. They felt shame that they had her, that somehow for them, in their understanding, in their simple understanding, she was a punishment for them for something that might have happened, something somebody might have done years before. But that girl didn't have a quality of life. And others looked at them with pity. How do we deal with disability in our own society? I remember going to Lourdes for the first time, and this was before I was married or anything, and I saw a mum who said goodbye to her child who had no recognition of her, at least so I thought. And I remember being so moved by the mum's care and concern, and my heart bled for her that he wasn't responding to her. And he required 2 or 3 carers during the weeks. And I was thinking, what burden did she carry when she was caring for him at home? And when he came back from the pilgrimage, his mum met him, and I've never seen such love. It was an unconditional agape love that went above and beyond, and they had that encounter together, and I was deeply moved. So does that change the story for us if he was disabled? Jesus would have been even more shunned in a way, or questioned, because why would you go with somebody who's put on the outskirts of society? So that really threw me when I was reading this. And it's a new, Father James Martin is an American Jesuit, and he put it forward, but I also heard it from Jean Vanier, who set up a L'arche Communities, that if Lazarus was disabled, then this miracle is even more profound. Anyway, we'll leave that bit there. We'll park that for a bit. So Jesus stayed 2 more days where he was. Why did he do that? Because he knew that if he went earlier and Lazarus hadn't been dead very long, he might just well have been extra poorly or been unconscious and then raised him. He knew that if he waited, and in effect it was 4 days, because they had a day to send news that he was ill. That was probably the day he died. Then he spent 2 days longer doing the work that he was doing. He wasn't out of, they weren't out of his mind and his heart. His mind and heart knew what he was going to do. He was going to do a miracle which was going to blow everybody away. And it's a miracle that was echoed in the Easter week, his own story. So it was almost preparing for that Easter story and resurrection. So in those days, there's a Jewish belief. I did a Jewish funeral fairly recently, and I did some reading up. And for the Jewish people, especially at that time, they believed that the soul of the dead person stayed around the body for 3 days, and it was looking to find a way to go back in the body. And if you actually think about that, there's customs that we carry in our society, aren't there? And my wife's a nurse, and I've been with people when they've died on the ward, and the old-fashioned nurses go and they open the window to allow the spirit to be free. Little things like that, which, you know, why did they do that? But for the Jews, 3 days was the spirit would go back into the body if it could. After 3 days, decomposition would start, and there was no place for the spirit to be. So the spirit would go. And where would it go? It would go to a place of Sheol, which at times is wrongly translated as hell. It's not hell. It's a place of the shadows, where there's no sort of happiness. It's sort of a dreary world of the dead. So that's where Sheol, some of the Psalms say, don't they? Sheol cannot thank you. Those who go down into the depths. So that's the place where the spirit goes. So we've got a lot of confusion here now, haven't we? We've got Martha and Mary, whose best friend Jesus hasn't turned up. They still love him. They're still very close to him, but they're probably, imagine Martha going out to the end of the homestead and actually looking out to see if he's coming, and then Jesus died. So that moment's passed and they're just deep in grief. They would bury straight after death. So when I was in Spain, if somebody dies, the burial is actually the next day. And that's quite hard to get your head around, coming from England, where it can take up to 2-3 weeks. And somehow in that 2 or 3 weeks, you come to terms with the loss. But suddenly when somebody's there and they're not there, that's the biggest remarkable thing that I find about death. How can you be there 1 minute and not the next? How can you have that soul, that spirit, that life, that personality 1 minute, and in the moment of death that changes irrevocably? So they will have experienced that. They would have anointed him. The caves in those days were there was often an antechamber where they would lay the body, they would anoint the body, and then they would wrap the body in linen, bind the legs, and bind the head separately. So that was where Lazarus was lying in the tomb. So the other thing that would have happened, as I said, when I lived in Kenya, it was the most remarkable thing. When I was there about 2 days, I was invited to a funeral. I thought, oh, this is going to be interesting. I've never been so blown away in my life, because this man had died in Lodva up in the desert, and a lorry had run over him. So it was a tragic story, and I went to the funeral. And I was warned it might last quite a long time. They're usually buried on the 3rd day. The first day would be preparations for building the coffin. And I've been with families where the carpenter has come outside the hut and they've looked through the window to get measurements, and they'd build the coffin, put the body in the coffin, and then they would usually kill a cow or a sheep. And everybody from miles and miles and miles would come around. Mainly a lot of the people that would have known the person, but the other lot would come because they wanted a good meal, they wanted a nosh up, and actually there was free food. So they'd come almost like official mourners. They'd come to swell the numbers, but to get a good a beer. And at night you could hear the drums playing. And during those 3 nights where they hardly slept, they talked about the dead person. They told stories. What do we do when somebody dies in our households? When the family gather, and that's the most important bit, we do tell those stories, don't we? We might not do it in the same way as they did in Kenya. So in Palestine at that time, the Jews, the neighbours, would come round and they would have been with Martha and Mary. Sometimes they would have official mourners that would come and they'd turn up, probably get paid, and there would also be a ritual mourning. Not very good at that in this country. So I remember visiting a family in a homestead, and it was just after the AIDS pandemic had hit. So a lot of people were dying of AIDS, HIV and AIDS. And I remember going into this homestead, and I was on a push bike, and I cycled in when there was two ladies. They were literally ululating, which I can't do. It's like and crying and wailing and beating their breasts. And I thought, God, they must be really close relatives. And then the elder of the house just told them to shut up, and they stopped, went in the kitchen, started preparing the meal. So the emotion wasn't there in the same way. But the fact that they do it gives vent to emotion. At some point, something will change within them. So there's a physical reaction to death. It's for us, we don't quite know how to be. What's our reaction when we see somebody who's died? Often to cross the road because we don't want to upset them. We're very closed as a society. I guess in Ireland we have the wake, so lots of people will turn up. And there's that lovely story of the people turning up in the house the night before a funeral, and they went to see the coffin in the morning, and there was no body there. They'd actually taken their mate out and had a few glasses of Guinness with him. So different culture completely. And all of this Jesus comes into. So what happens now? If we actually think, where would we be at this point? 3 days after somebody's died, the reality is just starting to sink in. We're probably still in shock. Grief hits us in so many different waves. If it's been after a long illness, we'll feel a bit guilty because we might be a little bit relieved because we couldn't do it anymore. Those deeply, deeply human feelings of loss, of desperation, of so many things. Sorry, my front door's just gone. Hello? Sorry about that. So, sorry, I've lost my train of thoughts. So, sorry, I've completely lost my train of thoughts. So going back to Martha and Mary, Martha goes to meet Jesus now. So what does she say? How is she feeling? I would say if I'd asked my best mate to come and he's a bit late, I'd be a bit miffed, a bit peed off probably, but also I'd be so pleased to see him. If it's somebody that I really connect with, I want to see him. I want him there. So she goes out, and what does she say? She meets him. Why didn't he come earlier? So what she do? She expresses her despair. If you'd have been here, my brother would not have died. It almost slips out, doesn't it? And it's not meant in a really angry way. It is meant in a really sad way. That she believes that maybe he could have done something, but that moment's probably passed. But then she professes her faith. But whatever you ask of God, God will give you. Isn't that incredible? Not maybe in the way that she expected, because if he'd have come, he might have saved Lazarus, and Lazarus has already died. So that's already gone, that moment, hasn't it? So she expresses her disappointment, her sadness, but then she expresses her faith. And that's when Jesus just goes into that beautiful, beautiful, which should give us all hope. I am the resurrection and the life. But he said, do you believe that I can raise him? And Martha says, well, I know he'll be raised at the end of time, but that's no good to me now, is it? The Jews had a belief that at the end of time, Jesus would be resurrected. But actually, for Martha, she was grieving now and the pain of losing her brother, her only brother. If he was disabled, if he was, in some way, she would have felt even more responsible for him, even closer to him. So she knew that he would be resurrected on the last day, but Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. If we actually think about our own losses now, all of us will have lost somebody at some point in our life. What would it be like to hear those words? And did we really hear those words when we're immersed in pain? St. John of the Cross is a Spanish mystic, and he talks about the dark night of the soul. And I think this is one of the moments that we have, the dark night of the soul, where somehow we've got our faith, but our faith is distant from us because we hurt too much. We desperately want to believe that there is something else, and of course we do somewhere deep down, but we're so hurt by the loss that we can't enter into that joy. I remember having a bit of a conflab with a born-again Christian, an evangelical Christian, and he couldn't wait to be with Jesus. He was so excited. And I shared his excitement because, you know, when I die, I want to be with God, but I want to be here as well. I want to be real. You know, I love my life here, but I love my life when I will be with God, when that time comes. And am I looking forward to it? But yeah, I suppose I am in a way. I'm not really, really excited because I like my glass of wine on a Friday night. Uh, I love my children. I don't want to leave them yet, thank you. And I don't think there'll ever be a time when I want to leave my children. It's that unconditional love, but I know that they'll be safe. So it's working out. Think about our own losses. And when we hear those words, I am the resurrection and the life. If you believe in me, even though you die, you will live. Wow. That's incredible. If we can really hear those words for our own losses in life, then it should change us. We should be changed by it. So, the moment of death, the Jews felt that time and eternity met and kissed. Isn't that a beautiful phrase? Time and eternity met and kissed. I remember being with a couple in the counselling room, and he'd just been told that he had a terminal illness, a life-limiting illness. And it was such a beautiful moment. I was privileged to witness this couple who'd been together for 45 years and so in love at this moment of excruciating pain. They sat and they just talked to each other. And one of them said, the one who was dying, he was so hurting for the person who was going to be left behind, because he said, I'm going to die, and that's okay because I'm going to be with God. And when I open my eyes, you'll be there because there's no time in eternity. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, how can I witness this beautiful, beautiful person speaking in that way? But he says, I know that you will be stuck in time, that you will have the span of your years, your time given you before. And he said, that will be harder for you, but I'm okay. And I often think of that lady, how she was comforted by that somehow, that he wasn't suffering. So it just makes us think in a slightly different way, doesn't it? If we actually think about what does heaven mean? At college, we study something called eschatology, the study of the final things. And one of the loveliest things that I took away from this course, which was very boring at times, was that in the moment of life when we die, we will meet love face to face. And in that moment, we will see love face to face and realize that we haven't loved as we should. We've done some kind of loving, but we've been selfish. We've looked out for ourselves first. And in that moment, we realize it, we are purified. In that moment, we see love face to face. Maybe that will be like it for us. Maybe in that moment, it was like it for Lazarus. Who knows? So the other thing I wanted to sort of come into here is that we're talking about physical death, and we'll go on to that a little bit more in a moment. But also our Lenten journey. How are we doing in our Lenten journey? I haven't been so good. Actually, doing this talk has been really good for me because it's tied me into really thinking and reflecting. My wine intake I was hoping would be good, but it hasn't been quite so good. But it wasn't about that. Lent's about conversion, isn't it? And as we move into this story with Lazarus, how can we relate it to our Lenten journey? So for me, how can I, if I'm lying in the tomb, what is there in me that's a bit dead? What, am I dead to other people's needs? Is there somebody in the family who needs me? If I go through those words for love, that stores, that family love, that philia, that brotherly, sisterly, friendly love, have I done enough for them? Have I been in touch with them? Have I looked after them? Have I contacted them when I'm feeling down? Is there something that stops me from loving God and believing that resurrection? Is there something that stops me from doing it? We'll tie that in at the end again. So, one of the loveliest things that the story of Lazarus comes is that Jesus was deeply moved in spirit. So what does that mean? There's two lovely words. I wish I could speak. When I was in Spain at college, they tried to teach us Greek and Spanish, but my Spanish was no good. So you can imagine the state of my Greek. But there are two words, tarasim, which means a shudder or a sigh, and ebrimesthal, which is like a horse snorting. And those words are used in different versions to say that Jesus was deeply moved in spirit. So what does that mean? If it's a horse snorting, it's almost like he's angry. So is there an anger? And if it's an anger, what's it about? Jesus was deeply moved in spirit. Something deep in his heart shifted, in his soul. And then I thought, relating it, I remember when my dad died, I've never experienced the depth of grief. It was the first time, I guess, somebody really close to me had died. I'd lost a brother, and that was a similar experience. But something came out from the very depths of my being, and I sobbed. And I think that's what Jesus was doing there. He saw Lazarus in the tomb, hadn't seen him yet. He saw Martha and Mary suffering. He saw the Jews around, some of them really close friends. He was a friend of theirs, and something moved him deep in his heart. That blew my mind again, because it means God is a God with us. What did we say at Christmas? That bit, Jesus coming into our world to share our humanity. This is the moment he shows us that he really shares our humanity. He has entered into the depths of our spirit, the depth of our grief, and he's experienced it. And then it was interesting, he said, there's a piece where it says Jesus wept, and they're the shortest words in the Bible, the shortest phrase, Jesus wept. But wow, if Jesus really did weep, what does that mean? We can actually go to him with anything. He feels our pain. He feels our sorrow. He knows when we lose somebody we love, the depth of that anguish of spirit. So be touched by that. It's really interesting. The Greeks at that time would have thought of God. There's a word of God, which probably comes from our modern world, apathy. So the gods were up here somewhere. They were completely untouchable. If they felt emotion, it meant that somebody else could have control over them. So for them, they believed that the gods were immovable, implacable, no emotion at all, but there as a power source. What does Jesus show? That's not his way. He wept. He felt our human pain. So our God is not isolated, is not passionless. He's a compassionate God. A heart that is full of agape is a heart who is full of love that will go into our world as that babe in a manger, but then comes into our world at that moment of death. And then we see it echoed in the Easter week when he dies for us. So it's about bearing witness somehow. So what happens then is Mary comes into the scene, and there was a really lovely little phrase that Martha went quietly to Mary. She sent word quietly because I think she wanted Jesus to have a bit of time with Mary because they were very close. But the Jews were all in there, and Mary was probably just in the room trying to have some quiet, even amidst people. You know, you can be alone in a crowd, can't you? So what happens? All of the Jews get up because they think Mary's going to go out and see Lazarus. And that was the bit, that was part of the mourning, is that you spent time. You didn't have idle gossip or chatter. You just stayed with the person who was mourning. I recently had a Syrian family, and the father died. And I didn't know the rituals that they went to. And I started talking to the wife before he died. She came in for some support. And she wasn't allowed to go to the funeral. And she hadn't realised, even though she'd been married to him for 40 years, the two sons were able to. And then the week after, her house was full of relatives and friends, whether she wanted it or not. They sat with her for a week's mourning, 7 days of mourning. So, you know, it's entering into those cultures you can see. So poor Mary gets up to have a word with Jesus. Whole lot go out with him. And what does she do? She falls at his feet. We've seen her fall at his feet again and anoint him. But this time she just fell. And what does she say? She says similar words to Martha. If you'd been here, if only you'd been here. And he wasn't. But he leads her on then, doesn't he? So then we actually come to the most intimate part in a way, isn't it? It's Jesus walking with Mary and Martha. He sees the pain, and this is where he weeps. He's touched deeply in his heart. Where have they laid him? So they all troop off to the grave. And I just love Martha. She's one of the strongest women in the whole story. The whole of the gospel, she's a passionate woman. And she gets there and she's got full of all the emotion she's got. And Jesus says, roll the stone away. And what does Mary say? I love that there's a King James version of the Bible said, but he will stinketh. I love that expression. But he will smell because he started to rot. 4 days in the heat. I lost a sheep in Kenya, and 3 hours after it had died, it had started to decompose because of the heat. There was the whiff of putrefaction. 4 days on, Martha's concern is, don't go in there, it'll stink, it won't be pleasant. And Jesus' response to that, he said, do you really believe? There's a little bit of her faith, which isn't quite there, isn't it? Because she's worried about the practical stuff, you know, it'll smell. So Jesus goes in, and what happens then? He says, Lazarus. He shouts and commands him, Lazarus, come out. So Lazarus came out, and he was still bound by the clothes that he'd been wrapped in, by the linen cloths. So what does Jesus say? Untie him and let him go. So the whole bit of Lent for me, what do we need untying from? We've got this beautiful narrative of human grief and suffering and Jesus coming in and changing that. But also there are things in our lives we need to leave in the tomb, we need to get rid of, we need to let it go. We need to hear those words, Jesus saying personally to each one of us, to Larry, to Suzanne, to Wendy, to Marianne, to Carol, to Charles, to Stella, to Anthony, to Mike, come out. What does that mean for us? Is there something that stops us from loving? Is there something that stops us from entering into our faith deeper? And they're the most beautiful things. And Jesus asks other people to unbind them. It's not just him doing. He could have just, you know, got rid of the clothes, but he asks other people. So we're a community. We're privileged to have the word of God coming into our homes tonight. And we are a community, aren't we? Even online, which is lovely. So what can we do? What can we do differently? How can we love differently? How can we enter into the Easter story differently? And just to finish, I've got another page here. I'm not going to go into that. So 3 things that I've learned as a counsellor. I did my training was under somebody called Carl Rogers, and he says that people can grow if we provide 3 conditions, and they're perfectly embodied in Christ. And the 3 conditions are transparency, you are who you are, unconditional positive regard, that whatever anybody does, there is still a soul, there is still a person in that body. So you can, I love somebody once said, condemn selfishness, but don't condemn the person. And the other one is empathy. And one of the loveliest things about empathy, and Jesus has shown it by when he cried, is the phrase, your pain in my heart. That is amazing. So Jesus is felt our pain in his heart, and he went through and fulfilled the miracle of Lazarus in order to show us that he is truly human. He is truly God because he created that miracle. He rose, Lazarus rose from the dead, but he was to die again. So he's not, in a way, he was resurrected, but resuscitated. Whereas when Jesus dies at Easter, he doesn't need those grave clothes. Those grave clothes are folded up at the end. He doesn't need them again because death has no dominion over him. Death has no more power. So there's my reflections. I'm sorry, I've gone off on trundles. I've looked at half my notes, haven't said half of it. But dying to selfishness and being raised to a new life of love. Repent and believe in the gospel. I loved it. There was a priest who once said, turn away from selfishness and believe in love. And if we can try and do that, Lent isn't over. We've still got days of Lent and entering into Holy Week. Try and enter it into a deeper way. And let's listen to those words of Jesus. I was going to read it again. Have we got time to read it? I'm not sure. Or do we need to? Just if we read it again, some of those things that we've talked about. And I want you to hold on to those three words to remember that we said. I'll paraphrase it a little bit. There was a man named Lazarus who lived in the village of Bethany with the two sisters, Martha and Mary, and he was ill. It was the same Mary, the sister of the sick man Lazarus, who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair. Jesus, Lord, the man you love is ill. And on receiving the message, Jesus said, this sickness will not end in death, but in God's glory. Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Yet when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed where he was for 2 more days before saying to the disciples, let us go to Judea. He said that, and then he added, our friend Lazarus is resting, and I am going to wake him. Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I am glad I was not there, because now you will believe. But let us go to him. And Thomas, known as the twin, said to the other disciples, let us go too and die with him. On arriving, Jesus found that Lazarus had been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany is only 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to sympathize with them over their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus had come, she went to meet him. Mary remained sitting in the house. Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now, whatever you ask of God, he will grant you. Your brother, said Jesus to her, will rise again. And Martha said, I know he will rise again at the resurrection on the last day. Jesus said, I am the resurrection. If anyone believes in me, even though he dies, he shall live. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she said. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, the one who is to come into this world. When she had said this, she went and called her sister Mary, saying in a low voice, the Master is here and wants to see you. Hearing this, Mary got up quickly and went to him. Jesus had not yet come into the village. He was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who were in the house sympathizing with Mary saw her get up so quickly and go out, they followed her, thinking that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Mary went to Jesus, and as soon as she saw him, she threw herself at his feet, saying, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And the sight of her tears and those of the Jews who followed her, Jesus said in great distress, with a sigh that came straight from the heart, where have you put him? Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. The Jews said, see how much he loved him. But there were some who remarked, he opened the eyes of the blind man. Could he not have prevented this man's death? Still sighing, Jesus reached the tomb. It was a cave with a stone close to the opening, and Jesus said, take the stone away. Martha said to him, Lord, by now he will smell. This is the 4th day. Jesus replied, Have I not told you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Thank you, Father, for hearing my prayer. I knew indeed that you always hear me, but I speak for the sake of all these who stand around me, so that they may believe it was you who sent me. And when he had said this, he cried in a loud voice, Lazarus, here, come out. The dead man came out, his feet and hands unbound, bound with hands of stuff, and a cloth round his face. Jesus said to them, Unbind him and let him go free. I forgot to say, and it was a lovely bit, when Jesus said that prayer, Father, I thank you, the word he used was Abba. Ab was a father figure, but Jesus used the word Abba, which is daddy. So that closeness to our humanity again, he's witnessing the closeness he had with his father. And the last words I'm going to say was, I went to the massive chrism at Westminster Cathedral when Cardinal Hume, who was a Benedictine, a beautiful, gentle man, and he stood at the chrism mass and he said, my heart is full, my heart wants to cry, but now we're going to turn our emotion into prayer. And then he said about Good Friday at the same thing. He said, behind the darkness of the cross is the light of the resurrection. So may we feel that in our loss, if we're bereaved, if we're suffering, that behind our troubles, behind the difficulties that we find ourselves in, there is hope, there is light. Thank you. Sorry if I've gone on a bit.